Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening we're going to look at a very important issue that is taking on new importance as we speak, in part because of the dramatic weather and climate change driven catastrophes that are happening around the world. In fact, when you turn on the news nowadays, it's not the news and weather. It's the weather that is the news. It's become the central theme, not only in this country, but around the world. And in fact, we're getting reports of unprecedented circumstances around the world that we need now to take into account. We need to look at it in particular and its impact on the capacity for civilizations to keep going. No known biological organism can outlive its food supply. Humans will be no exception. We're very directly threatened if our food supply is threatened. Local populations are threatened when they don't have food, and global populations will be threatened if we cannot continue to produce food. Yet we're in the process of killing the soil that actually feeds us. Humans don't produce food. Plants produce food. Plants need topsoil. And we've gotten ourselves into a situation that's very, very precarious because in the search for profit in the production of food, we've taken on a complete adaptation to petro-intensive agriculture, using fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, killing everything else in the field, and as it turns out, we're finding out, killing the life of the soil. So let's pay attention very closely to the way climate is impacting soil. We get it very directly from the World Food Programme's Director of Emergencies, who just this week spoke about circumstances in southern Africa because of the cyclone, unprecedented in nature, that hit there. Take a look.
Turn to the worst weather disaster in the history of the Southern Hemisphere. Cyclone Idai has caused extensive flooding and left behind what looks like inland oceans since it made landfall last Thursday, battering Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi. The World Meteorological Organization has called the storm the Southern Hemisphere's worst tropical cyclone on record. Officials say the death toll is over 400. The number is expected to rise. More than 400,000 people could be displaced in Mozambique. And President Filipe Nyusi said as many as 1,000 people may have been killed. The World Food Programme warned of a major humanitarian emergency that's getting bigger by the hour. This is WFP Emergencies Director Margot van der Velden.
Confronted with severe flooding and cyclone effects, 600,000 people affected, possibly even going up to 1.7 and more million people affected by cyclone and flooding, communication completely broken, infrastructure severely damaged, particularly in the city of Beira, but also all the roads to Beira have been cut off.
Rescue workers in the flooded city of Beira struggled to reach survivors who clung to trees or pleaded for help from rooftops after 90% of the coastal city, which is home to 500,000 people, was destroyed. This is a survivor of the cyclone in Beira.
There's someone up there. There's a big tree over there. This person is sitting on that tree since Friday until today, without food or anything. How are they supposed to live? So I'm going there to help. There are other people needing help there, full of them actually. I already rescued my family, always using this canoe.
Cyclone Idai dropped more than 2 feet of rain in parts of southeastern Africa, nearly a year's worth of rain in just a few days. An extreme weather event that climate scientists say is consistent with models of climate change. For more, we are joined by Dipti Bhatnagar by Democracy Now! Video stream. She's usually based in Maputo, Mozambique, where she's climate justice and energy coordinator at Friends of the Earth International, but is joining us from Penang, Malaysia. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Dipti. Can you explain the extent of the damage?
Thanks, Amy. It's really heartbreaking to be away from home at a time like this. But interestingly enough, we've been at a climate justice meeting here in Penang, Malaysia. And back home, our communities, our people are getting battered from all sides by this disaster. So of course, as you said right now, the cyclone Idai has hit the coast and then it's gone inland into Zimbabwe and Malawi and affecting hundreds of thousands of people and wiping out 90% of the city of Beira. I live in the south, in the capital in Maputo, and that area has not been hit. But we are in touch with people in Beira, family, friends, family of colleagues who have been hit. And we're still waiting for information from a lot of people that we haven't heard from. And of course, this is a huge disaster to have hit Mozambique, and already about 2 weeks ago when I was home, we heard of a lot of flooding happening in the Tet province, which is the Zambezi River Basin. So basically there are two river basins that have been affected by flooding and people sort of trapped in between, and some of it is related to the cyclone and some of it is related to rain upstream in the catchment and the dams in Zimbabwe letting go of water, and that's also affected a lot of people. And as you just heard, it's absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, you've had people stuck on rooftops, you've had people stuck without water and food, and a lot of organizations from Mozambique, including mine, which is Justiça Ambiental, meaning environmental justice, from the capital, which is Friends of the Earth Mozambique, has been trying to do whatever we can to support the relief efforts, because the very most urgent thing that's needed right now is to be able to get emergency relief to people who are still could have a chance to survive.
Well, you can see the level of the disaster. It's unbelievable. It's both in terms of its severity in any one place and its extent. Hundreds of square miles are completely inundated. And you can see from the color of the water, in fact, the soils are being ripped off the top of the earth. They'll be going down into the ocean as sediment, but the capacity for the populations, once all of this subsides, to grow anything is completely undercut. This is a disaster on a scale, as they say, unprecedented in southern hemispheric history. Staggering in its implications. It's not only there, obviously. We've begun to see it, in fact, in the United States. In the Midwestern floods. Take a look.
While the southern hemisphere faces its worst tropical cyclone on record, states across the Midwestern United States are continuing to recover from unprecedented flooding this week that devastated communities in Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, and particularly Nebraska. Warming temperatures, snow melt, and heavy rainfall led to a flash flood that overwhelmed the Missouri River. The rising waters breached levees, killing at least 4 people, destroying or damaging thousands of homes. Much of the news about the flooding has focused its impact on farmers, but the climate change-fueled weather has also hit Native American communities hard, with 4 tribal nations in Nebraska declaring a state of emergency. This is Larry Wright Jr., chair of the Ponca tribe of Nebraska, speaking last week.
Today, I've declared a state of emergency for the Ponca tribe of Nebraska in our territory as it relates to our homeland in Niobrara, as well as our communities in Norfolk and Sioux City. And we'll continue to monitor the situation as we move forward and with the flooding.
Scientists warn that more flooding is on the way as a climate change-fueled extreme weather patterns around the planet. Santee Sioux chairman Roger Trudell, whose tribe faced unprecedented flooding in Nebraska, told Earther, quote, "I'm just sorry that our national leaders, the people with the power to do something about it, just put their head in the sand and pretend that there's no such thing as climate change or global warming or anything when it's so evident. They should be ashamed of themselves," he said.
Yeah, they should be ashamed of themselves, especially since we have no response to it. There's going to be a food crisis out of this immediately in the area, relief food. But beyond that, these are the productive areas, both in Africa and in the United States, that are food-producing regions. They're not going to be able to plant this year in either place. And that's going to impact the food supply of a much greater range of people. The upshot of that is pretty extraordinary. Take a look at the National Public Television assessment of it.
Now a look at the mounting toll taken by the ongoing flooding across the Midwestern United States. Thousands of homes are damaged and vast swaths of farmland underwater, leaving local residents and public officials trying to cope.
In some places, the floodwaters swallowed entire neighborhoods and washed away bridges.
There goes the Mormon Canal Bridge right there. It just washed out.
Swelled with rainwater and snowmelt, the Missouri River crested to its third highest flood level on record. The Missouri River's flood crest breached numerous levees, including one that destroyed a water treatment plant in the small town of Peru, Nebraska.
There's no potable water in town other than the 2 days supply approximately in the city's water tower, and that's being supplemented now by the National Guard bringing in pallets of water and local church groups as well.
Record-breaking late winter floods have led to statewide emergency declarations in Mississippi, Missouri, Nebraska, and Wisconsin.
Okay, pretty extensive, pretty disastrous, and in fact so extensive and so disastrous that we're up against a different kind of thing.
Look.
Take a look.
Devastating, truly devastating floods have hit the state of Nebraska. 74 cities, 65 counties in that state have declared emergencies. Joining us now is the Governor of Nebraska, Pete Ricketts. Governor, thank you for being with us on the show. I know that you toured the damage. Describe to us what you saw, please. How bad is it?
Well, this is the worst and most widespread flooding damage we've had in our state's history. As you mentioned, 65 counties out of 93, which means that over 2/3 of our counties have declared an emergency. And what we're seeing is just widespread destruction to public infrastructure, to homes, to businesses. This really is the biggest disaster as far as damage we've ever faced in our state.
So, would you just listen for a moment to Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue? He was on the show yesterday. Listen to what he had to say about agriculture in your state. Roll tape, please.
They think there may be as many as 1 million calves lost in Nebraska. That's catastrophic, and we're going to do everything we can to help those people get back on their feet.
I'll repeat that, Governor. 1 million calves gone in Nebraska. What do you want from the federal government?
Well, right now we filed our paperwork for the federal disaster declaration. And so we're encouraging the federal government to be able to process that as quickly as possible so we can begin tapping into those resources. Just from an agricultural standpoint, we think we've got at least $400 million in livestock losses, $440 million in crop losses. We think the public infrastructure damage is in the hundreds of millions of dollars as well. We've had over 2,000 homes, 341 businesses that we know of. These are just the initial assessments. We're still waiting for floodwaters to go down to be able to do a more detailed assessment. We know we've got 200 miles of roads, 14 state bridges, and that doesn't count any of the county roads, county bridges, U.S.
Well, you get the idea. This is more than $1 billion worth of damage within one state, right? And they haven't yet had the receding waters subside enough to be able to make an accurate assessment, a more complete assessment of what's coming next. Well, this is all happening at a time when climate change around the world is creating stress on global food supplies. Harvard just this last week held a conference, a little panel, to discuss this at the School of Public Health. Feeding 10 billion by 2050, creating a sustainable and healthy food future. They had the former secretary for Barack Obama's Environmental Protection Agency. And they both, along with several other experts in food production, started talking about the global climate circumstance we're facing. Take a look.
All of the events of the past decade, all of our memories, have something in common. They all took place during the hottest decade ever recorded since humans began keeping temperature records about 150 years ago. In the last decade, the Earth's temperature rose roughly 1/3 of a degree Fahrenheit. Since 1880, it's risen about 1.5 degrees. You might say the Earth's running a fever, and scientists predict it's going to get much worse. Already, we can tally the signs. Global sea level rose by over an inch during the decade, almost twice as fast as the average during the 20th century. Arctic summer sea ice declined by over 300,000 square miles, enough ice to cover the states of Texas and Kentucky. The vast majority of climate scientists say evidence for human-caused warming is clear. But less understood is exactly how this warming will change the complex interactions between our planet's land, water, sky, and the living organisms that inhabit our world.
So, Gina, you're kind of, as a former EPA administrator, you're kind of in a good position to talk about the relationship between climate and food, so if you would fill us in.
Well, let me just start by thanking Walter for doing this report and all the other researchers. It's remarkable that it's the first time we've really ever looked at what is a healthy diet and what are the foods we need and what does it mean for the planet. It's great to be healthy individually. I'd like to still make sure people are on the planet as well, which seems to be a key issue. And I think really that's what it's all about. We have to look, as Walter said, at how we produce our food. You know, it's not just about what kinds of food, but how we produce it. And when you talk about what kinds of food, we have to recognize that, you know, food is really culturally and in many cases religiously embedded in how people think about their lives. This is a big shift that needs to begin, or should have begun a long time ago, in how we look at food and how we get people to demand food that's both healthy for them and meets their cultural and religious needs. And then secondly, you have to look at how you produce that food. You know, right now we have industrial agriculture, factory farming, that we know is degrading our environment. And we also know you have to think about the future under a changing climate with droughts and intense floods. And how do we change the way we think about growing food to make sure that it retains the carbon, that you have rich soil, that you don't rely on fossil fuel fertilizers and pesticides, that you shift to organically based farming, and you think about the best way you can to actually keep farms local to the extent that you can, because the third issue is how do you manage food? Because we waste 40% of the food between the farm and the table. And then we have to think about how do we get people engaged in this. We want them to demand healthy food, but we also want them to have a rich sense that, of where
the food comes from, as she says. And in fact, that's not easy, because we have illusions about where the food comes from. We don't realize how much of it is oil. Take a look.
We faced an enormous crisis a generation ago, early 1950s, 1960s, and for a reason. It was the first shift in the fundamental strategy of agriculture that had occurred in 10,000 years. Agriculture, because it's catastrophic, must constantly have new land. It must constantly have new land because it also creates excess population, and those people need a place to go. So, from the beginning of domestication of wheat 10,000 years ago in the Middle East, what is now Iraq, ironically enough, to about 1960, agriculture had a single strategy, which was it compensated for its weaknesses by taking new land. In 1960, we ran out of new land, period. There was no more, essentially. And we've colonized some new land since 1960, but we've lost an equal amount of things like salinization, loss of water. So basically, our arable land base, our farmable land base, is the same as it was today as in 1960. At the same time, we were faced with a period of enormous population growth. We were at 3 billion people then. And a lot of real smart people were looking at those numbers and saying, we're going to see famine within our lifetime. Massive, widespread die-off famine.
Now, he goes on to explain that we didn't because we turned to petroleum subsidies of our food system with the Green Revolution. Take a look.
The hidden fact in all of that was that all of that increased production depended not just on short plants, but on energy, fossil fuels. Because the chemical fertilizers that took advantage of that short plant architecture come from natural gas. It's a straight-off conversion of natural gas into fertilizer. But at the same time, we're using enormous amounts of energy to plow the field with tractors, to process the food, because grain can be eaten straight up. You can't go out and eat a piece of grain like you can a green bean or a tomato. It must be processed in some way. It must be cooked. And to transport that energy, because we have a globalized, centralized system, then there must be an enormous amount of transport. As a result of that, all that is that if we take a look at about 1940 and an American farmer, that farmer was using roughly a calorie of fossil fuel to make a calorie of food. Today, that same farmer uses something like 10 calories of fossil fuel to make a calorie of food. That means that petrochemicals, fossil fuel, have become embedded in our food supply. We put off the catastrophe that occurred a generation ago with fossil fuels. In other words, we didn't colonize new farmlands, we colonized new oil fields and new watersheds to make irrigation water. If we run out of fossil fuel, that strategy will collapse in a heartbeat. And we will be at exactly the position we were a generation ago when we had 3 billion people we couldn't feed, only now we have 6 billion people, exactly double the number.
In fact, we have 7.5 billion people since he spoke, and agribusiness has taken over the discussion of agricultural production. Take a look at even the forthcoming issue of this. Business in the era of climate change, food, diet, and climate. Well, this is an event that's taking place here in Boston. You can get in on it for a mere $15. You can get a ticket to talk to the people on this panel, or at least listen to them. And it's going to occur when? Well, on Tuesday, April 2nd at 6:30 p.m. over at WBUR's new City Space. Here are the CEOs of various food groups, food organizations that are going to be featured that evening. Well, keep in mind what's happened to our food system. It's not altogether encouraging. In fact, it's very discouraging when you're even in the countries where there is a bountiful food available.
A new analysis by the Environmental Working Group finds 70% of fresh produce sold across the United States is contaminated with pesticide. Topping the list of contaminated produce are strawberries and spinach, while more than 9 out of 10 samples of kale were found to contain residues of pesticides, with some leaves containing up to 18 different chemical compounds.
18 different chemical compounds in one leaf. Now, this is pretty staggering. The question is, if we turn to increased production, is it already too late for the world's agricultural systems? Have they been hijacked by the petrochemical logic of production, where more and more pesticides, more and more herbicides, more and more insecticides are being used and kill the life of the soil in the process of producing poisonous food? Well, we've even gotten to the point where various people like this are saying why renewables can't save the planet. People like Michael Schellenberger are saying, what? Renewables can't save the planet? Really? That means we're committed irretrievably to non-renewables? That means if our agriculture is dependent upon non-renewables instead of renewables, we won't be renewed? There is no future for agriculture? Let's start to look at this. Well, 30 years ago, people started pointing out the carbon problem, Jim Hansen, and within a few months, in fact, within 3 months, that same case was made for the stability of world agricultural systems. In effect, it was pointed out to the Senate at the time, growing soil needed to take place in order to save the human prospect. We couldn't keep destroying topsoil because of the carbon impact of that. In effect, Jim Hanson's kept that point alive for the last 30 years, at this time with his granddaughter. They've sued the U.S. government and taken it to the world at large. The case has been made again 30 years later at Oxford by similar personalities.
Just take the case of agriculture. Humans don't produce food. We can't produce food. The best you and I can do if we go out in the sunlight is get a suntan. And if we stay out there too long, we'll get sunstroke. But we don't photosynthesize. We depend on other organisms that do photosynthesize. Right? There's a ratio between the green leaf and the human population. As I said, anybody who thinks that humans can infinitely expand has no idea about how an ecosystem functions. In an ecosystem, all you can do, your best role as a human species, is to learn how to favor the environment for plants to grow. In other words, you can produce topsoil, topsoil produces food. And if you're lucky, you can get enough of that back to you to keep going. But if you're not producing topsoil, if in fact you're doing what every country, in every continent, in every culture is doing at this point, destroying topsoil, you're on the wrong side of the evolutionary trip here. And your journey won't be long.
No, it won't be long, because it can't be long. Petro-intensive agriculture wastes energy and releases massive amounts of carbon to the atmosphere. Major question for our survival is simply this: in the midst of a rapidly changing climate, can the human community reconvert the world's petro-dependent agriculture to a solar sustainable system? If not, we will perish. It's as simple as that. No known population can outlive its food supply, and if we can't make that agriculture solar sustainable, we're perishing. Fortunately, there is the Citizen Science Alliance